Hi, good morning. In the previous lecture, we discussed how Peter Bruegel transformed the experience of looking at the Renaissance, especially for 20th century viewers like us. So, while we seem to think that the Renaissance was primarily about the aristocracy and the church and the feud between the nobility and the Catholic Church, uh, this Dutch Renaissance artist, Peter Bruegel, suddenly transformed our perception by relocating the way we look at our perception into the rural spaces, away from the urban centers of Venice or Florence. So we are taken to rural uh, parts of the Dutch Empire, the Netherlands, and we are given a glimpse of the everyday lives of uh, the Dutch peasantry. And in that process, he seems to have given us, a very curious window to understanding the experience of the Dutch Empire, but through the experience of the peasant. And I also clarified at the end of that lecture that the procedures of that lecture was made possible because of a higher resolution image that I was able to download from Google, and it was in many ways a window to help us understand the ways in which technology can enable us, right? And in today's this particular session, I'll demonstrate how technology can enable the process of experiencing art in a very different way, primarily through illustrating it through what Google did to paintings and our experience of looking at paintings. Now, the relationship with technology and human beings is quite old, but if I have to recall an iconic essay where this is addressed, it's Walter Benjamin's The Age of Art in the Age of Technology, a work of art in the age of technology, or it's also called the work of art in the age of technological reproduction, right? So in it, he's specifically focusing on how our perception of the self transformed with the invention of photography. So suddenly you have this equipment that could imprint what you looked like, and it is easily accessible to the rich and the poor. But what it did was also transform the role of the artist. And interestingly, it was the invention of photography that led to the transformation of a painting style, and that led to the creation of the Impressionist movement. But that's the subject for another lecture. So what happened in this particular essay is in the first part of the essay, he talks about what happens to our perception, human perception of the self because of photographs. And from there, he leads on to understanding how paintings and photographs, because of technology, lose their aura. But he goes on to talk about propaganda, because this is essentially talking about how human beings fall for propaganda, created by fascist governments and so on and so forth. But what he had to say in that particular essay is also very interesting to us, because when he says that technological reproduction of a painting causes it to lose its aura, he's saying something very important, because before photography was created and before the Industrial Revolution, if you had to go look at a Renaissance painting, you would have had to physically move towards the museum, travel across countries. An example is, if you wanted to see the Mona Lisa created by Leonardo da Vinci, you would have had to go to Paris, to the Louvre, and stand in queue and look at this single painting. On the other hand, what happened with technology and by photographs is that there were small prints of the Mona Lisa that were created, recreated, reproduced, and that were cheap for procurement, and that were easily circulated by people. And so suddenly Mona Lisa was accessible to different people from different walks of life in different corners of the world. And that, in a process, democratized the experience of looking at a Renaissance painting. Uh, so, the subject of the previous lecture was Peter Bruegel and how he democratized the characterization and the representation of the Renaissance. And in this part, I'm going to talk about how a technological giant like Google, using its incredible team of talent, transform our experience, our viewing experience of art in general. But the the one art form that I'm focusing on is Peter Bruegel, and we're going to look at his famous The Harvesters. But we're going to do this through Google and Google's website, and we'll see how it transforms, like the nature of viewing art. So when we begin our search for Bruegel's The Harvesters in Google, we begin by opening up Google, and then we type in Google Arts and Culture, which happens to be the first option, and then we click on Google Arts and Culture, and it immediately opens up the page, which has a very interesting way, as you can see, of characterizing paintings. It's come up with an interesting art filter, which might help us transform our experience of Van Gogh, it assures us. As we go further down, we see that it's got a small advertisement about the installation of the Google Arts and Culture app through the Google Play Store and through the Apple Store. So we further come down, it tells us that it's possible for us to explore museums using this particular thumbnail, artworks, or almost 1 lakh artworks. It says game section and places. As we go further down, it helps us get a glimpse of the Bauhaus architecture. Art projector is a very interesting feature of allowing us to display the Mona Lisa in the art form. And as you'd see, as we keep scrolling down, it's got some very interesting features. Here is a musical journey with Kandinsky, the famous Russian artist. There is recreations of the great modernist paintings. It's a fascinating interface because it gives us, a window to accessing art in an entirely different process. But we are here to look at Bruegel's Harvest, and for that feature, we have to go up here to this section called Games. Then when we open that, it opens up into this fascinating space, which, it's minimalistic, it's neat, and we have to keep going down, and it's seen that the Google team has come up with a lot of experiments, puzzle party, visual crosswords, art coloring book, which allows us to experience these masterpieces in an entirely different way. But we have to come further down to find our particular painting. Here is The Harvesters, here is Van Gogh, and here is Frida Kahlo. They have created a process by which we can zoom into these paintings and look at it, and that is the peculiar feature that interests me. So for today's session, we'll be looking at The Harvesters. And it opens up, it informs us that that this particular representation of Bruegel's Harvesters was sourced with the cooperation from the Met, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Now, it is important for us to appreciate the significance of what we are under, what we're doing here, because what Google is facilitating for people like you and me who haven't visited New York City yet and who haven't been to the Met Museum is that we have an opportunity here to look at and closely introspect Bruegel's famous The Harvesters. And Google does it in this fascinating process. So let's see how Google allows us to experience Peter Bruegel. And there's a message, and you'll see that as we scroll up and down, it gives us a historical perspective. It tells us what it was, but these are just brief information. You can look at it if it interests you, but what I'm more keen about is looking at the painting itself. So, when we first look at that painting, it tells us that it can allow us to zoom in and zoom out of this particular painting, right? But Google's facilitated how it's going to guide us through the viewing experience. So, in the last lecture, I guided you using the mouse and the cursor. We were able to zoom into different sections of the painting because, of course, it was a downloaded image. But here, Google also has a way in which it is guiding you through the painting. Now, what is different from the representation of the pheasants in the wedding dance and the harvesters is obvious. You'd see that the setting is the farm, which is a site not of leisure or festivity, but as a site of work, right? So the scene is probably the afternoon because we have a group of people sitting here and having lunch, but some men are still working. They've probably had their lunch. There is a man reclining by the tree and trying to catch a small sleep. So here are pheasants on the occasion of their work and not on the occasion of festivity, and therefore they are set against a bigger landscape, which okay, there is in the foreground is the immediacy of the field with the crops, but far away you see the port city and the ships and so on and so forth. So there is a way in which Bruegel circumscribes the experience of the Dutch Empire into a single painting. But we'll see, we'll understand that as we go through the painting in detail. So the first thing that Google wants us to pay attention to is this, in a particular scene where the men are indulging in work, and you see that there is a lot of attention in the the posture of this man who seems to be exhausted by what he's doing. But these two people are industrious, and you see them drawn in to the work. You can look at it, pay attention to the blandness of the color, and compare it with the festive scene of the wedding, and you saw how colorful that painting was. Here you see them wearing only whites and gray, a dirty gray, and therefore you see them that this is a scene from work. Immediately Google asks us to shift to the right to look at the face and the posture of this particular pheasant who's having this short sleep. He's resting, he's unbothered, he looks really exhausted, but he's also the center of the foreground. In a sense, therefore, he is the attention of the painting. Further away, you see some men and women who are crouched closer to the ground and who are engaged in the work. And the words of Marianne Ainsworth, the curator, are stated in this particular feature. So that just to give you a sense of being in the Met Museum. The next scene that Google wants us to pay attention to is this particular scene of three women who are walking away from the field, again engaged in work, and you see that they seem to have a similar color of clothing. grays and whites, and they are set against this huge yellow fields. But away from them is this uh, what appears to be a scene very farther away. You see a small cart carrying this huge bundle of hay pulled by two cows, further away from the field, and therefore still, giving us a glimpse of pheasantry and working and so on. So, but to the right is another interesting scene of these men, and we are told that these are monks who are stripping down to take a bath in the pool. Indeterminate, we don't really see the faces, but we just see postures, and they seem to be relaxing. These are monks. Um, and then away you see children, away from the monks. Further away from all the pheasants, you see children, and some, they're probably their mothers. Focus here, mothers standing and waiting for these children to conclude their games. Um, and then we go further away, we come back, and we are able to appreciate how distant this particular scene is from this particular scene. We see the pheasant engaged in work, and the children are so far off, play and work so distant from each other. Okay, but yeah, and then we immediately shift to this particular scene where you see a woman having cheese and bread. Um, and we are taken closer to it, and it says this seems to be a form of indulgence because there are the men working, but here are some people engaged still continuing to have their lunch, and it seems to be a particularly indulgent lunch. But you see this particular man having milk, and in spite of it having cheese, you'd see that what they're consuming are essentially products of their own labor. Um, you don't see them having fruits, for instance, right? And then we come back to the scene just to appreciate what happens. But next, we are again shifted back to the background of this painting, and then you see that the condition of the climate is particularly warm and dull. It's middle of the day, and we're taken to the farthest end of the canvas where we are shown a couple of ships, and we know that this is the port we are talking about. Now, this is, in a manner, how Bruegel is introducing the Dutch Empire to us. So here are ships that would go on to colonize other parts of the world, and it shows another glimpse of the Dutch Empire, while the foreground was about pheasants and their work and wheats and their leisure and so on and so forth. But here, you see the port city in grey and so on and so forth. It's so far away from the bright yellows of the fields. We see another scene, which is further to the right, closer to the background. There are scenes that which which seem inconsequential, but small details like this that show the remarkable genius that Peter Bruegel was. You're seeing this young kid who's imagining working, uh, and then we seeing the details such as this small fruits hanging by the tree, and all of these are just small parts of a painting. We're looking at the grass on the ground, and you're seeing how much attention Bruegel paid to recreating the world that he saw. And it also, in many ways, demonstrates the importance the amount of significance he paid. He really seemed to think that it was essential to portray reality of the pheasants in its most honest form. And then the colors of the yellows and the greens are distinguished, and suddenly you sense that this painting is unique because of the amount of detail it had managed to accumulate in this particular scene. And it helps us appreciate what Bruegel was trying to do. But here we must also appreciate what Google helped us understand, because Google took it upon itself to democratize the process of viewing art. Now, certainly, anyone with a good internet connection, without having to travel to New York City, without having to pay the entry ticket to the Met Museum, anyone with a decent internet connection can now look at Peter Bruegel, look at this incredible work of Western art and appreciate it for what it is. And that gives us, as I said in the beginning, another glimpse of the role of technology in our everyday lives and how it can transform our experience of viewing, appreciating, and critically analyzing art. Uh, Thank you.